Thank you very much, Bonnie. Wonderful place. Greetings to Dr. Ford and to President and Dr. Hennington and to all of you. I'm here because my friend Chuck Cook told me I had to come, and so I have come. And when I get here, I find out that I'm delighted to be here. I had no idea what this place was, but it's cool, isn't it? And that's why you're all here. Thank you a lot. You don't know anything about me, but you just like this place. So I'm going to tell you about Winston Churchill. How many people were at an event today at the golf club? So some. So I apologize to you. I spoke there today, and I'm going to say some of the same things, but some different, because my memory is poor. So God knows if I can say the same thing. I'm just going to make 2 points today about Winston Churchill, about why he was important and about what we can learn from him. You're going to see that this place and what happens here represents something that dominated his life, and almost no one knows that. The things that you do know about him are true, except for the ones that are not, I guess. But he was what you know. He was exactly this height. He was, just shows we short people might get something done. He was a great war leader. He was a brave man. By the time he was 26 years old, he had written 3 best-selling books, and a 4th was on its way, and he had fought in 3 wars and been distinguished in all 3 and observed another. It later emerged as a spy in Cuba. And then he reached his 26th year, and then he got elected to Parliament. Winston Churchill wrote 50 books. They're worth reading. Sir Martin Gilbert, whom I had the privilege to work for and courted my wife Penny in his house back in the late 70s. She was then 4 years old. Else she would have never been so foolish as to marry me. He was once standing, as one of his favorite stories, in a group where 3 former prime ministers of Great Britain and 1 prime minister were standing, and one of the former ones asked Martin Gilbert who wrote Winston Churchill's speeches. And he replied, he was embarrassed, right, because Lady Thatcher was one of the people in the room, the prime minister, and she knew the answer to that question. And so she sort of looked down at her feet. The man who asked the question was actually the person she defeated for the office. And Martin said, well, he wrote his own. And the man asked him, how did he get time to do that? And Martin Gilbert said, well, he worked very hard. It's not actually what the answer is. The answer is it isn't fair. He was a genius. Of course, he had an enormous influence on the world through especially his actions in the year 1940, when his country stayed in the Second World War. There are people here whose parents, are there any veterans of the Second World War here tonight? Thank you. And people whose parents were. Everybody today is still touched by that war. But for Winston Churchill, it's likely that we would have never got in it. Because in May of 1940, the British got close to getting out of it. I'm going to tell you that story just briefly in a minute to illustrate my points about why he's important. So those things are all true, but what I'm going to tell you about him might be surprising to you, and yet I submit that they are the main themes of his life. And it's very hard to study Churchill in this way. There is so very much. Nobody wrote so much, recorded so carefully, closely what he thought. Nobody so much written about him. Maybe Jesus. So it's hard to study him in that way, but of course in another way, thank God he was a good writer, because it's fun to read him. So why is he important? Well, one is we have some advice from the classics that's worth my repeating to you. It's very revealing about what we are and about what we need from statesmen, even if we don't often get it. Do you ever think about what an odd contraption you are? You know, I've learned that here, they're thinking about that all the time. What they're trying to do, and they're very good at it, Mr. Ford is like lightning quick at it, is break down into parts the feats that we human beings accomplish in our souls. And he himself was interested in understanding that. How could mind or soul, human beings have a rational soul, how could that arise from an organ which is matter? That's the question that led him down the path he's walked, and he's exploring that here in the natural sciences. Well, it places us in an odd spot that we can do that, because in one level, we're just like every dog and every wolf and every chickadee. We got to eat or we'll die. We have to sleep or we'll die. We have to drink or we'll die. And even if we do all those things, eventually we'll die. We are necessities, active, moving, living creatures. And we have all of the instincts that they have. And yet, in the middle of that, you know, we reproduce. Our actually biological relations among ourselves are tighter and closer and more complex than other animals because, you know, I happen to know, being in the college business, and also because my wife and I have 4 children, they take a third of your life to raise. And if you were some other kind of creature, you wouldn't know who they are. And we live in a time when the family's breaking down. But the truth is, we have data about what that means. And, you know, kids who grow up in the old kind of family, you can say that now, what was understood to be the natural family, tend to do better than the ones who don't. So do you see, we have this biological nature that's just like the other critters on Earth, except maybe more constraining of us in some ways. And then on the other hand, there's this other thing about us. And it's quite separate from our living and our existence as an animal. It's what gives us, for example, our sense of shame. Because when we do something deliberate, and we're capable of doing that, and other creatures are not, according to the classic authors, there's something sitting in judgment on what we do. The question is, was it the right thing? And that's quite separate from the fact that we have done it. And it's quite separate from what our interest is. You know, we need stuff, right? We have scruples about stealing it. And even those of us who steal, and plenty do, they make up reasons about why it was right later. And so this sense of right is very different from what we actually do, and different from our needs. And the classics say that the place where we reckon about that, where those two things come together, is a quality of soul called practical judgment. And that means taking into account the circumstances, which must be taken into account in whatever you do. And taking into account also your ultimate sense of right. What is the truth about this particular situation? And Aristotle, for example, writes that that is the testing place where we live our lives and form our characters. And he says it's hard to learn how to do that, although we all have to do it. And if we want to learn, we should study the people who have the reputation for doing it the best. And that tends to be people who make life and death decisions in public, in politics, decisions that affect us all. So now, think about that for a minute. First of all, I'm privileged, I guess you would say, in my life to know a lot of famous statesmen. And I don't look to many of them for life advice. So it's kind of an odd thing to say, isn't it? But on another level, think what they do. Think what they live through. Think what they have to do. I'll just give you that one example from Winston Churchill, because tonight 2 people have asked me about it. So the Second World War started on September 3rd, 1939. On that day, Neville Chamberlain called Winston Churchill and invited him into the government. He took over the Navy. Second time in his life he'd done that. And then the war really starts in Europe, in Poland, because the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany made a deal that they were going to carve up Poland between them. So Hitler attacked them from the west, and Stalin attacked them from the east, and they spent a few months carving up Poland and also Finland. Shared it out between them. Kind of a feast for a couple of imps. And there wasn't much happened in the West. But on the 10th of May, 1940, two things happened that make an odd coincidence. One of them is the Neville Chamberlain government fell, of which Winston Churchill, by the way, was a part, and had spent May 8th and 9th, had spent those days defending Neville Chamberlain in the Parliament. Very well, he was an extremely able speaker. But on the 10th, the Chamberlain government fell, and by a narrow margin, the king was advised to send for Winston Churchill, and he became prime minister, succeeded him. And also on that day, Hitler began his attack to the West, May the 10th, 1940. So what's the news the first day Winston Churchill is prime minister? What's going on, right? A great country, France, with the largest army in the world at that time, would be extinguished in 6 weeks. Nobody believed that could have happened. And he's reading about that every day. On the 12th, he restructures the government. He'd learned a lot in the First World War about how to do that. And he restructured it so he could manage it all. And so they could fire him, but if he stayed in his job, he was going to get to control the direction of the war. And he hadn't known how to do that in the First World War, and he thought he made mistakes because of it. And so on the 12th of May, he says the famous thing, I will say to you in the House what I have said to my colleagues in the administration, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Not quite hope and change as a campaign slogan, but bracing. And it's a very lovely speech. You should read it. It's about that long. And so then every day is a new disaster. On the 23rd of May, so he's been prime minister 13 days, they get a call from Mussolini, not yet in the war. The man who got the call was Edward Halifax, Lord Halifax, who was the foreign minister and one of the chief appeasers. And Mussolini said, I'm offering to form a peace conference because France is going to fall, and we could make all this up. Hitler doesn't mean you any harm. And Halifax thinks this is a good idea. Halifax is in a war cabinet that Churchill has formed, along with Neville Chamberlain, Clement Attlee, and Arthur Greenwood were socialists, and Churchill. They're 5 people. And if either Chamberlain or Halifax were to resign the government, then it's likely the government would fall, because they still had a lot of support in the Conservative Party. That was Churchill's party too. And they had 2/3 of the House of Commons. So Churchill couldn't really say to Halifax, no. And you know, he was famous for talking and talking fast. And he didn't say much. We have the records of the war cabinet meetings. He says, study it, puts it off. Second day, raises some resistance, gets some resistance back from Halifax. It goes on like that for 5 days. And Churchill called a meeting of the whole cabinet, and it was revealed in the meeting of the whole cabinet, which is about 25 people, what he really thought about this. He thought, us alone, overwhelmed, with our army not clear how much of it's going to get back from Dunkirk. Penny's daddy was one of the people who got back on the last day. If we announce that we're talking to the Germans, the spirit of fight will go right out of our country. They'll think it's over. Whereas, and think what might happen if that happens, because what's happened to the countries that made their peace with Hitler, what happened eventually to Italy itself, which was never invaded by Germany. And yet, Mussolini, the last 3 years of the war, if he ever went to see Hitler, he thought he might be shot on the way out of the building. He was frightened to death. That's what it was like to be around that guy. And so Churchill gives this speech. He calls the whole cabinet together, and there are notes of the speech from 2 guys. The best one is a guy named Hugh Dalton, who was a very left socialist member and loved Winston Churchill all his life for some reason. Churchill hated socialism, as I'm going to say in a minute. And so Hugh Dalton writes down that Churchill said at the end of his remarks, He said, the strategy was, he said, we have a big Navy. If we can maintain it in the water, they can't get over here. If they get over here, they're going to take the country. To protect the Navy, we're going to have to fight an air battle. Their air force is bigger than ours. Of course, the famous Battle of Britain would start soon. But he said, the battle will be over our territory. And that matters because we'll get our pilots back if they're not killed. And also our planes will have more linger time over the scene of action, and that makes our Air Force relatively bigger. It'll be a fight like that, he says. And he says if they do land, they're going to start taking towns in the south of England that have names like the towns in New England. And they will read about that in America. And everything ultimately depends upon them. I want you to understand that I'm going to argue that Winston Churchill is the greatest statesman of our time, and I'm going to tell you what I mean by that, and he meant by that. But also, you should absorb the fact that he thought all his life what Thomas Jefferson thought when he said that the United States of America is the last best hope of mankind on earth. That's what Churchill thought. The lifeline to which to cling, if we can but be brave enough to cling to it. And then he says, I've been thinking whether I should open negotiations with that man, meaning Hitler. He didn't say, we've been talking about that. He didn't say, we have an offer. He didn't say, there's some division among us in the war cabinet about that. He said, I've been thinking whether I should do that. And I believe that if for a moment I were to consider parley or surrender, every one of you would rise up and tear me down from my place. If this island story is to end at last, let it end when each of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. And he stopped. And they leapt up and rushed him. And there was cheers and patting on the back. And then they had a war cabinet meeting again, and Chamberlain said, I think if we started talking to them now, it would put us on a slippery slope. So now, I want you to understand, he did do that thing. And it changed world history. And it's not possible to know for sure that it changed it for the better. Because, you know, a lot of people were killed who might not have been if they'd patched it up right there. Penny's father, after he got off Dunkirk Beach, was shipped to Singapore. Captured 2 weeks later. He was the commander of a Japanese POW camp for 4 years. You think he remembered that fondly? Actually, I'll tell you something weird. He kind of did remember it fondly. He's a funny guy. He was a lawyer, but he could make stuff, and so he made a flute out of a pipe and the brass off the end of a fire hose. He made a lathe out of a hand-cranked postage meter. He could build stuff around here for you. He could build your robots, right? So Churchill did all that, right? And I want you to understand, Churchill regarded that as a very heavy responsibility. And you should think of him that way too. He was a man who took on a lot of responsibility. He wanted it, and he discharged it, and you can make up your own mind whether he discharged it well or not. I have made up mine. So he did that. And I guess he's important for that. He's also more fundamentally important because we can follow his reasoning about things like that because he wrote so much. And the record of his life is so rich that we can know what he was thinking every day and almost every hour in those 5 days from May the 28th to May the 23rd to May the 28th, and almost every other day of his life. And so when we think about how to make our own choices, here was somebody who might be pretty good at it, and maybe you could learn something. Especially when you figure that Winston Churchill, probably more than anyone in that room, was afraid of war. And that brings me to my second reason he was important. He was a man of our time. What is our time like? Our time differs from all other human times in this specific respect. And by the way, it's all about us in this building right now. We live with the power of modern science, and it changes everything. And Churchill figured that out. First time I know that he wrote about it was 1898 when he was 24 years old. You know where he saw it? He was on a battlefield outside Khartoum in the Sudan. Young guy. All the young British soldiers wanted to go to every battle that came up, all the young British officers, and they would all queue up and hoard and gang themselves up outside the War Office, waiting for some officer to come out so they could accost him and say, please let me go there. About that particular war, Churchill had written 2 of his 3 best-selling books already, and he'd had interviews with the Prime Minister and the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne, and he had asked as a favor both of them to get him appointed to the expeditionary force to the Sudan. And both of them, the Prime Minister and the heir to the throne, had asked the commander to appoint him, and the commander had refused them both. So he went anyway. He just got on a boat and went. And he's there in this battle. And this is a battle against the First Islamic Republic, probably. The ancestor of the current ruler of the Islamic Republic in the North Sudan was the ruler of the founder of that republic. And Churchill doesn't like that Islamic Republic. He doesn't like that kind of thing. He likes freedom. He likes equality. He likes the open society. He really dislikes that one. And yet, he was horrified by the battle, which was an overwhelming victory for the British. What they did was they built a railway around the shallow parts of the Nile, and they got modern weapons down there. And they mowed down 35,000 charging dervish soldiers, so that the one who got the closest to the British line came within a football field and a half. And there's bodies piled up, over 4,000 dead, probably 8,000 or 10,000 counting the wounded, lying, writhing in the ground, right? And the British weren't hurt at all. And Churchill said, gosh, look at those guys. They're so brave. And what we've been doing back here, he said, is tedious. Tedious in a battle. That means courage in the battle doesn't matter as much. It means now technology matters. Think of that. It means for every soldier saved by a weapon, a modern weapon, there's another killed. But it's not just soldiers. Because what does war become, right? Now, just think of September 11th, 2001. If, 11 guys had attacked New York City with the Gatling guns that were invented right after the Civil War, already a very big development of technology, we would long since have forgotten about it. It wouldn't have made news for a week. But they didn't even need a weapon. They just had to put something really heavy up in the air and get it going really fast and then run it into something. And that was impossible 100 years before this event happened. You see what that means? Churchill saw it with bright eyes. First time he ever looked at it, and he said, gosh, look what war is about to become. He was afraid of it. From before the turn of the 20th century, he was afraid of it. He said in 1925, he wrote, "Shall we all commit suicide?" is an essay he published. You know, he wrote like that. Mankind has never been in this position before. Without improving appreciably in virtue or enjoying wiser guidance, he has got into his hands at last the means of his own destruction. Death stands waiting at attention, silent and expectant, waiting for a word from a frail being, so long his servant, now for once his master. That's an interesting reflection for the greatest war hero, statesman of the 20th century, isn't it? Now, I'll say a word about science. Churchill also loved science, like these people here. And there are two things about it that are awesome. The first one is simple necessity. That is to say, without science, we'd all starve to death. There's so many of us here. Without science, we'd be overwhelmed by any people that had it in any war. Do you know the philosopher Jack Handy from Saturday Night Live? He has aphorisms, right? In my family, we have them all memorized. We're all students of Jack Handy. I can imagine a world without war and without weapons. And I can imagine us conquering that world because it'd be really easy. See, Churchill thought that Britain, whose population tripled from about 1850 until about 1950, that they would starve to death without science. You'd have to depopulate the island again. There's no going back. But the second thing is positive, right? That's a negative reason, and it's inescapable in my opinion. The second thing is positive, and that is science is a beautiful way of knowing. Around here, right? Do you see the excitement in their eyes when they describe to you what they're doing? And to them, it's not just the people they help by assisting them with their disabilities or improving their powers. It's not just that. It's more than that. It's that inside that ability to do that is the solving of a great puzzle. And they love to undertake that and do that. You know, we have this science division. If you want to see what I mean, go to the Hillsdale College website and look up convocation speeches. It's easy to find. And one was given by a physicist named Ken Hayes, and one was given by a chemist named Chris Van Orman. And watch those speeches, because you will see people electrified by what is known in their disciplines. And it's awesome. You know, the Milky Way is very beautiful. And you know, people have looked at that since classic times or before, since we have writing, they've looked at it and thought it was beautiful, right? Now we have the most awesome pictures of it. But that's not the half of it. We have awesome pictures of things equally or more beautiful that are on the other side of it. And you look at those things and you go, wow, look at that thing. And did you know that as far as we can tell, there's about as many stars as there are cells in the human body? And both of them are simply incalculable numbers. There's so many. Awesome, right? Churchill loved that kind of thing. He had a friend named Lindemann, physicist, great man. He made a baron of him. And Lindemann would dine with Churchill and just explain the universe to him. And Churchill loved that. In fact, one of the most famous stories is true. Churchill said, I'll bet that I've drunk enough spirits to fill this room. And, you know, today we all have little hand things, you know, our iPhones. But Lindemann carried a slide rule. And he said, how much do you drink? And Churchill told him, and, you know, Churchill, by the way, I should dispel the rumor, was never drunk. Hated drunkenness, wouldn't ask you back if you were drunk at his house, but he did drink, you know, pretty much all the time. And he told him, and Lindemann paced off the room, and he knew how old Churchill was, and he did some calculations, and he walked over to the wall, and he put his finger about 6 inches off the floor. And Churchill said, so little time, so much to do. But the point is, you remember what I said about the unusual nature of the human being, that we have these animal needs and these animal instincts, and we have these consciences, and the same thing that gives us these consciences, the same thing that lets us stand outside our own body and judge ourselves as if we were a third party, which is what we do when we're embarrassed or proud, either one. That same thing makes us able to contrive. And that can be dangerous, not just in war. Churchill was at least as afraid of peace as he was of war. First of all, look what he saw. Do you know much about the workings of the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany? If you don't, go read the Wikipedia article and then read 2 books. I invite you, if you've not read them, you must. One of them is 1984, by George Orwell, and the other is Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler. And what you will see in those novels, and it will give you a shiver, is the power of scientific and comprehensive despotism. Each conversation controlled, one's own children scientifically turned against one as an informant. The most beloved things, weapons against one. Go watch the more modern movie, The Lives of Others. It's a very great movie. About the East German Stasi. And one of the things that you learn is, when you're brought in for an interrogation by the Stasi, and one in 6 East Germans was a Stasi member. So that means, look around the room. How many would be here tonight? Would I finish my lecture? You see? But, making the lecture and hearing the lecture and discussing the lecture, those are the fundamental human rights. And to interfere them is to interfere with one's humanity itself. And there's a growing doctrine in America today and other countries that interference ought to be made. But if you were questioned by the Stasi, you sat on a chair that had a leather seat in it. And the reason is it would hold a scent. And when your interrogation was finished, however many hours you sat there, then the leather would be taken up and rolled. It was made for this, and put in a sealed jar. So they always had your scent, so you could be tracked by the dogs. Churchill thought that this kind of government, that there were tendencies in the Western democracies, including his own, that were just the same, and starting in the same place. It's the human capacity, through science, to contrive and control all of nature. Nature is not a standard that restrains and empowers us, not the laws of nature and of nature's God. What do those mean anyway? Those are just an old time-bound phrase from the 18th century. No, what we are doing is overcoming nature to make the world however we want. And in particular, we should make the world more equal. And the only way to make it more equal is not just to equalize property. Other things have to be made more equal too. One of the early lines of thought of left-wing historicism, and left-wing historicism is where we get socialism and communism, and right-wing historicism is where we get National Socialism. And Churchill said they differ from the North Pole differs from the South. That's to say, they're not very close to each other, but when you're there, you can't tell the difference between them. And see, look at all these human institutions and how they divide us and tear us up and make us unequal. The worst of them is the family. Why the family? Well, because, gosh, we love our own, don't we? I'm very fond of saying that our college has started 13 charter schools now, right? And they're going to be 50 eventually. And they're really cool. And we love them, and I'm very proud. I thought it up. Right? Aren't I clever? But there's one of the charter schools that's radically the best, much the most important, infinitely more important than any of the others. And it's an accident and a coincidence that its headmaster is named Kathleen Arnn O'Toole. And she's a PhD, and she's really good at being the headmaster. And guess who she calls when she's got a problem running that school? And if she calls me right now, I'm going to talk to her. And I don't care about you guys. And if the chairman of the board calls, I'll put my phone down, right? Because she's my girl. That's what matters. And isn't she adorable? I mean, she is, of course. And also, she's our life. She's our particular charge. What did my father think about me? Just that. And what did he have to give me? The answer is my third of an estate, 50 grand, and a love of books. My dad was a school teacher. I grew up around books. I grew up thinking you're supposed to read them. I grew up thinking, great if you know what's in them. What did it say, son? Tell me what it said. No, don't tell me what you thought about it. What did it say? Then you can tell me what you thought about it. Think what a gift that is. He gave that to me because I was his son. Is that fair? You know, you won't come out just equal if you let that thing go. Everybody will be a little different. Some will have advantages. I mean, my dad didn't have any money, but what would I choose? Having to choose. First of all, I make a living, as it is. Jack Handy says, it's easy wanting other people's money. That's why I like it. So you see, the current Secretary of Education has said in recent weeks, he just retired, this guy, that the broken families in the inner city are such a critical problem that we have to start government dormitories to raise the kids in government buildings. Now, one wonders, how will they grow up to be independent of the government? And do you know what Churchill speculated about? Seeing socialism come. In 1931, have you read Brave New World? You should all go read that too. You guys are all so smart, you know, and so you come to this nerdy place. You must be a bunch of geniuses. And so he wrote in 1931 that, you know, we're going to be able to carry out the breeding of the human being in the laboratory, which we can do now. And he said, we could then make some of them better, or all of them better, or maybe what we would decide to do is make some of them worse. And then they could work for us and be happy doing it. Brave New World, see? He forecast that. Actually, he didn't read the book till 1958. We know because he wrote his wife about it. So it's possible that we are going to become artifacts. Through the power of modern science, we will become our own creators. In April, in the Wall Street Journal, go look it up, 2 Nobel Prize-winning biologists said we should have a moratorium on changing the germline DNA. That's the part that transfers to everybody and constitutes in some way the essential information of humanity. And we can change it, probably, to eliminate some birth defects. But if we do change it, we've changed us. And we are the creators of us. And then all of those questions come up. Now, I want you to know these glories that Churchill worked, his perception of the evil of the Nazis and the communists, which he had early before anybody else. All of those things, those are all products of a deep life of thinking about the conditions and the reality of human freedom and what it would take to protect it. So I'll close with this. What do we learn from him? First of all, we learned that power only raises the question, what do you do with it? And the sources of the power can't answer that question any better than common sense. The more powerful you are, the more it matters whether you use your power for good or ill. And of course, the fundamental question in philosophy, the question with which Mr. Ford began his career, is the question of the good. That's where Churchill's career unfolded. The next thing is about war, you should have a strategy. The strategy be contrived so you don't fight them unless it's absolutely necessary. You prevent them by being friends with the best people, by being goodwill toward everybody you can be, by having preparation so if somebody attacks you, they'll know they get a good kicking, and by fighting fast to get it over so you can go back to peace. And Churchill taught that since we live in an age where the accumulation of power is the signal fact, then we should study the arts of controlling power, especially political power. Because in this modern age where science is, we have to have very strong governments. But those governments must be checked and controlled. And the art of that is known as constitutionalism. That means big, grand rules that are written a long time in advance, and everybody's got to follow them, weak and strong alike. So if you study Churchill, it'll make you afraid. Also, it will show you what to do. Have a strategy. Have a constitution. Thank you. Thank you. What would you like to say? You guys, this man. You guys have to be big talkers coming to a place like this.
Several times you described Churchill as a statesman. Two-part question, kind of. Do you see any statesman in our future, in our lifetime, and do we need a statesman in our lifetime?
Yeah, okay, well, so first of all, here's what Churchill said about that, I'll tell you. He says that, this is the thematic thing he said about the capacities of the statesman and the general. First of all, the statesman is just somebody who runs a state. The distinction between statesman and politician is actually not there in the etymology of the words. It's just that some people are good at those things and most are not, because they're really hard to do. You know how many really great generals there have been? Do you know how many generals among the ones we know are great never lost a battle? I know of two, right? Julius Caesar and the Duke of Marlborough. Everybody else got beat sometimes, right? And yet Napoleon was really something. So anyway, it's rare, and Churchill says of that, nothing but genius, the daimon in man, can answer the riddles of war, and because genius is much rarer than the rarest and purest of diamonds, wars are mainly tales of muddle. So first of all, don't be surprised if you don't see somebody like Winston Churchill around. And I'm telling you, Winston Churchill, it's just, you absorb those facts I told you at the beginning. He could just do things that hardly anybody has ever done. He could do that. I don't know how he could do it. But he could. He was a genius. It wasn't fair. So do we need it? In critical times, we need it. The great crises in America are two, and maybe this is the third, which I maintain it is. I believe so. But it's harder to tell about the things you're amidst. The Revolutionary War and the Civil War, in both of those, we came very near to failing to found and then losing the Union. Both of them were very near-run things. And if you want to know the importance of George Washington and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, just go read them and what people thought about them. I mean, it's very remarkable. Today we blame the founders for slavery, right? But the truth is, they didn't bring slavery here. The miracle was they were against it, owning slaves, some of them. Jefferson, in the contest between the master and the slave, the Almighty has no attribute that can side with us. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I think that God is just. I think he's to be blamed for slavery. The important thing is he thought so too. And then if you want to know the importance of Abraham Lincoln, just read the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Understand the context. Lincoln is this poor country, ill-dressed rube. And Stephen Douglas is the most stylish man in the country and the obvious heir apparent to the presidency. And this gawky guy comes out on that stage, and 7 debates later, Douglas is a wreck. And you should just read him. And Douglas's plan was to refound the nation so that the question of freedom was taken out of its essence. I care not whether slavery is voted up or voted down, he would say. This country was founded on the white basis. And so we should do what we want in regard to them and our locality each time. And Lincoln's response, in the right to eat the bread that she earns with the sweat of her own face, the black woman is the equal of everyone here in her God-given right to tend her own life. See, that's the calling of America. And there's never been anybody so eloquent as Abraham Lincoln in sounding that call. Take him out of that situation and it goes different. So yeah, we need it.
Could you talk probably quite quickly about Churchill and kind of being dismissed by the entire country after the war?
They just kicked the daylights out of him, didn't they? Where are you from, sir?
North London.
North London, yeah. My wife is from Lancashire. Met her in Oxford. She's like you. She talks funny. Yeah, so Churchill lost the 1945 election by an overwhelming majority. And he himself, the polling back then is not like it is now, but there was some consistently through the war, and it indicates that he had 80% popularity. He drew 25,000 people to a speech during that election. He attributed the loss to two things. One, happier, and one privately he wrote to Alfred Duff Cooper, a good friend of his, something rather gloomier. The private one, the public one was, he said, look, we've been in charge, we conservatives, he'd been in the opposition inside the conservatives, we've been in charge of the country for 18 years, and look what we did. We're responsible for that. I don't blame them for being sick of us, and they've had a very hard time, haven't they? So, and he said in that speech, in that campaign, understand how strong he was. I submit to you what I told you tonight. I think that's the heart of the matter, right? He's in the most prominent places. All his life he talks about these things I just talked about, and about the danger of a bureaucratic, centralized scientific state overcoming the British people. He was desperately afraid of that. And so in 1945, in July, in a campaign speech, he said, the Socialist Party could not realize its ultimate aims without the use of a secret police, yes, I mean a Gestapo. Very powerful thing to say. They'd just been in the coalition government with him. Clement Attlee, their leader, and several other prominent ones were heroes from the First World War. Churchill said, now they wouldn't intend that, I know that, but this attempt to remake humanity so it can be equal in ways that it's not born to be, and in general to trim and taper and alter everything about them, will lead to that, because its failures will only call forth more efforts. He said that. And he got beat overwhelmingly, and so he said it again and again and again, as he had been saying it for 40 years by that time. So yeah, why did he get beat? He also said that it was disturbing to him, and this is in this letter to Duff Cooper, that the soldiers voted the way they did, and that one of his generals told him that the soldiers voted for the person who offered him a pack of cigarettes latest. And so he thought maybe that something terrible had happened to his country. But he didn't say that out loud. But think of the implications. On June the 19th, in 1940, am I getting the date right? I think I am. There's a guy sometimes with me from the college, and he always remembers these dates, and he fixes them when I don't get them right, but let's say this one's right. Churchill says, let us brace ourselves to our duty and so bear ourselves, that if the British Empire should last 1,000 years, men will so say this was their finest hour. Now, if you think about that for a minute, that means that this is a peak, and we can never surpass it, to stand up this way. And it's more dramatic because Churchill was the last guy in the world to want to say a thing like that. He was always, in the middle of the Second World War, he was asked, what should it be called? He said, that's easy. This is the unnecessary war. If we had just got ready, if we just had statesmen, we could have stopped this thing easy. So the point is, it's possible that the British were changed by that terrible experience. And he feared that. That's what he thought.
We have time for one more question.
Do you see any political figures in the Western world today that either are or have the potential to be a Churchill?
Well, potential. Ryan Walsh, David Morrell, Will Dunham. I have about 50 sons and daughters. And they're all people of first quality who are going to go places. Those 4 I just named, one of them is the head of the largest group of Republican congressmen, is a staff director of them in the Congress right now. It's a kid from my class. And 3 of them have been Supreme Court clerks. And they graduated at the top of their class from top law schools. And anything those boys can't do. They're just scary how good they are. And there's a bunch of girls like them too. So that's potential, right? Who knows? But they're very good. So you want me to name a statesman like that. And I will tell you, there's only one piece of evidence you could have apart from actually seeing it done. Because this is the part of our lives, see, where the testing place is practical. Somebody's got to do it to see if they could do it. And so you can only speculate about that. I have some favorites. Since he's not running for anything right now, I'll mention that Senator Cotton from Arkansas has been a friend of mine since he was in undergraduate school. And he's a very impressive man to me. I like him. If he were running for something right now, I wouldn't have mentioned his name. But the other thing you could do is find somebody, go read Lincoln's Peoria speech and the Ottawa debate and the Chicago, and the Lincoln-Douglas debates and the Chicago speech in 1858. Go read those and fix them in your mind. And then go read things that people in politics actually wrote and compare them. See if you find anybody. Because whoever it is, I think I can recite the first paragraph I ever read by Winston Churchill. I was bitten by a dog. We have boxers in my family, and before I got the fair penny, they were mean. Now she makes them into sweetie pies. But they never hurt people. But my first great boxer was named, of course, for the Norse god of war, Thor. And you can see what kind of kid I was. And he would get in dog fights, and I got bit right there. I have a little scar right there. And my hand swelled up. I treated it with medicine the vet had given me to treat my dog for the same kind of puncture wound. But the guy I was house sitting for had written his doctoral thesis on Churchill, and the books were there. I'll paraphrase. First paragraph and the third paragraph of The World Crisis. It was the custom in the palmy days of Queen Victoria for statesmen to expatiate upon the former glories of the British Empire. 3 times they had risen up to oppose overwhelming tyranny, and 3 times they had prevailed. Little did they know that the best was still to come. So you read those words and, you're like me, got a dog named Thor, and I went, ooh, this is a drama, isn't it? And then the third paragraph, he says, the war through which we have just passed differs from all ancient wars in the immense power of the combatants and all modern wars in the utter ruthlessness with which it was fought. All the terrors of the ages were brought together. The dead moldered into the soil. Whole populations were poisoned. Bombs dropped upon them from the air. He describes all that, right? And you see, you're in the middle of a great drama that's overtaking the whole world, and we're still in it. And I just read those words and I said, gosh, I was getting ready to write my doctoral thesis on Aristotle, which I still love and still teach, but I go, gosh, I have to read more of this. So I would look for that person. And you know how you, first of all, you won't become that person. Like everybody in this room, like you're here tonight, right? And good for you. You know, you come here all the time. Good for you, whether you like me or not, right? But the classical doctrine is you are what you do, see? And so if you want to be a worthy citizen, or harder thing, statesman, but citizens are just one form of statesmanship, then you have to prepare yourself all your life. And that means, you know, I've suggested some things to read. Read them. Keep a list. Work on it. Only read great things. That's another thing. See? I'm telling you, if you read Darkness at Noon, Brave New World in 1984, very well known. Read them again. It's awesome. It sends shivers down your spine. It's so good. Darkness at Noon might be better than that. It explains how comprehensive tyranny can be when it is scientifically applied. And then, you know, you want to hear something? I'll close with this, then we got to quit. So Winston Churchill, in this essay where he projected that we were going to be able to breed people to make them wherever social station we want, he says, I read a book once and it said that in 16 or 17 generations, people would be able to live as long as they want. They would have pleasures wider and deeper than we have ever known, and they can travel anywhere they want to go, interplanetary. They will have conquered all the trials of life. And then he said, but what would be the good of all that to them? What would they know any better than we know about the basic questions that we face in human life that make it worthwhile? Why are we here? What is our purpose? In fact, it is the persistence of these questions and the ache in the soul to know their answer and live in accord with them provides the best help that all will be well. That means that the fella, Hitler or Stalin or whoever, who says, I will take off your burdens and live your life for you. Because that's what totalitarianism is. That person cannot, in fact, offer you anything that you will want or find satisfaction in. And that's why we are not made for despotism. And that's why we are not going to live under it. Thank you.
Let's thank our speaker.